Hello and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC episode 68 with Linda Fisher, hospital chaplain with MedStar Washington Hospital Center. Welcome back, OTC listeners. It is just about done with August. It's, end of August, and a lot of places have started back to school. Some will be going back to school in the next week or two, heading into Labor Day, and, then on into fall and pumpkin spice and Halloween and everything else. So, my guest today, Linda Fisher, I actually was introduced to Linda through another former guest, Skylar Cunningham, who back in episode 36, he and I talk about, his work with the Cancer Trauma Project. And he passed me on to Linda because I had asked him about, hospice and hospital chaplaincy, and really wanting to connect with somebody in the hospital setting, which Linda is. Yes, it's I don't know if it's good timing or poor timing of just where things stand currently with COVID and the Delta variant and resurgence in numbers and ICUs being packed and things like that. Even aside from that, I had always wanted to talk with somebody in this world, because I find so much misinformation and misperception over what does a hospital chaplain do. And I think a lot of people, a lot of people have very negative views of hospitals and doctors, and they just, nothing good happens at a hospital, quote unquote, or, I never go to the doctor because they only give me bad news. And so I think the same thing happens with hospice and hospital chaplains and so many other aspects of just the medical world. And wanting to talk with her about what is it that she does. And you hear, Linda is just this amazing person. You can really hear just how sweet and warm and compassionate and empathic she is. And just the amazing team that she works with there at the MedStar Washington Hospital Center. So I hope that you take something from this. I know I say that all the time, but this really is the message, the mission of this podcast is to just try to explore different areas of the mental health network. I know for so many people, it's so confusing, what's out there, what resources there are, where to look, what does these things mean? So I hope that it's something that helps somebody out. Well, On the Couch listeners, I'm honored to have Linda Fisher on the show today. She is a palliative chaplain with MedStar Washington and has been in the field for a number of years. So thank you, Linda, for being on the show. Welcome.
You are very welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I was really glad we were able to put this together. I imagine it's been a pretty interesting year for you. Is that putting it mildly?
Yes, I would say I don't like to overuse the word unprecedented, but it is. In my many years of experience, I have never lived through and worked through anything like the last 15 months.
Yeah, I know a lot of people usually at the beginning of the year, they'll pick a word to represent like what they want the next year to look like. And I think looking back, I don't think anybody had unprecedented, but that's probably the word that described that year for a lot of people.
It was new at first, and now I find myself saying it, but I don't have a better word than that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Usually other than the big inhale with the oh,
Yep.
like that kind of describes it as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, tell me, how did you find your way to palliative chaplaincy? You know, what education, background, and what drew you to this?
Well, it is both a kind of global and long, circuitous story, and it's also a very direct line. I um, sometimes say, well, I was born service oriented. So this is my third career. I've been at this particular work for 18, almost, well, really 20 years, but employed as a healthcare chaplain for 18. Prior to that, I had a 10-year career with American Express as an account representative and manager. And prior to that, I worked in hospitality. So from the time I was 18 until today, I have worked as a service provider in that milieu, frankly, moving from more into a larger and larger and more significant and deeper way of serving. So that's the global conversation. I can only have it because I've been on the planet now almost 7 decades, so I can see that movement. But specifically, 20 years ago, my mother died. She died traumatic death in an ICU. And I was with her at the time it all took place. It was devastating. And out of that experience came this focus and the awareness that I was being called, invited to serve in a much larger milieu, that God was inviting me to work in a new way, in a different way. And
wow. Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, thank you for being willing to share that, and the interesting choice of words, the invited.
Yes. Well, both invited and like pushed off a cliff.
Yeah. Often that's the call, is sort of that way of like, no, I don't. I think the connection's bad. I can't.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm not up for that. Oh, here we are. But I can tell you, if I can tell you that story, I've learned to tell it briefly. But it does sort of lay the groundwork for everything that I have done in the way that I serve today. At the time that this happened, I had no contact with healthcare. I mean, I hadn't been sick. My family hadn't been sick. I didn't know what happened in hospitals. I didn't have a clue what a chaplain did. But that day when I got the call that my mother had an event, she was living in an assisted living facility, and they had said, we think she might need to be seen by the doctors. Her oxygen sats are low. We're just going to take her in. And I said, that's fine. I'll drive, an hour and a half to Chambersburg, actually. And when I got there, she was talking to me and everything was copacetic. They were taking care of her. But, the word I was sort of getting in one ear was, things aren't looking great. And I couldn't make that jibe with what I was seeing, right? My mother looked fine. She was talking to me. And then they took her to the ICU. I went with her. And as I was speaking to her, she just left the planet.
Wow.
And while she was talking to me, and I called the nurse, they came in, they said, uh-oh, they took her away. They brought her back 45 minutes later. And when she came back, she was on full, life support, intubated and on pressers, and was hovering between life and death.
Wow. So
that happened in the space of about, 40 minutes. Okay. So as I was sort of reeling from that, someone showed up at the door. There was a man at the door, slight build, had a collar on. I said, 2 questions that I've been asked like 400 times since then is, who are you and why are you here? And he said, well, I'm the chaplain, and I'm here to remind you that the Lord has not forgotten you.
Mm.
And I was a spiritual person, religious person, so I never imagined that God had forgotten me. But those words were exactly what I needed to hear. So the one person I could probably hear it from, and that was my first experience with healthcare chaplaincy.
Wow.
And
That's
what he did.
A pretty rough first experience.
Well, I'm still talking about it 20 years later.
Yeah,
So it
yeah.
was, right? And he came in, he sat with me through the worst night of my life. And out of that experience, and I don't remember another thing that he said, not one other word. Those words are burned into my brain. I forgot everything else that he said, except for the fact that he sat with me. He never moved. He tended to me. And that experience has shaped pretty much everything I've done for the last 20 years, certainly as a chaplain.
I always think of that, preach the gospel always, when necessary, use words.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think like so many, the in the helping fields and the medical fields of that, being touched by an event that then opened that door to, okay, this is something I'm passionate about or want to move into and want to help other people through. Yeah.
Yep. Yes.
So what, I mean, just like you had said, the question you get all the time is, who are you and what are you doing here? Who is the palliative chaplain and what are they doing there?
Well, I have about 15 to 30 seconds to answer that question when I walk through a door. Okay? And so what I will say to a patient who asks me those same questions, I will tell them my name. I'm Chaplain Fisher, and I'm here to see, how you're coping with everything that's going on. And pretty much I stopped talking. And at that point, people will either figure out that I'm safe, right? That it's safe to talk to me. People who are ill, who are suffering, who are hurting, who've had multiple layers sort of scraped off, right, are keenly alive to who comes in that room. Doctors forget that. Chaplains, social workers, who take care of the sort of the more the deeper levels of their personhood, I think can never forget that. And so they size me up right away using whatever they got. And then I'll wait and see what they tell me about what's happening right now. And 9 times out of 10, I'll get something that I can pick up and a thread that we can both follow. And my job, per se, is to assess this person for their spiritual distress, spiritual religious distress, existential distress, their resources, how they cope, is it working, and to see whether or not this person is someone that I need to follow, right? Not everybody, in the Episcopal Church, we talk about confession. Some may, some should, and none must, right? Not everybody needs to see a chaplain, but some people would benefit from it. And I need to parse out who I need to follow to potentially help them cope with the stress of illness, but also to allow them then to engage more fully in their care, because some of that pain and suffering impedes the actual delivery of the medical care that they need.
I imagine. I can and can't imagine some of the responses that you get. What are some of the myths you have to dispel? I mean, like you said, you only get about 15 to 30 seconds to connect with them, and you said you'll say those few little things and then be quiet and let them respond. Yeah, what I imagine you'll get a lot of, okay, you're here to, convert me, or you're here to administer last rites, or, yeah.
Yeah, the prevailing myth is that I'm there because they're dying.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get that from everybody, but I get it from enough people that I've learned to be prepared to address that.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in palliative care. As a palliative chaplain, I work sort of at the edge of my, so I have to be both the spiritual specialist, if you will, but I also need to be a generalist and kind of, are they breathing okay? Right? Is their breathing too rapid? Is the next thing that I need to do go find a doc? Right? Are they in significant pain that would impede my doing anything with them? Do I need to go find a doctor to help address some of the symptoms I'm seeing? So I'm not just there for the spiritual or religious or existential concerns that this patient might have. As a palliative chaplain, as opposed to typically a chaplain who comes in from a spiritual care department whose primary responsibility is the delivery of spiritual or pastoral or religious care. I have to be listening more broadly for what's going on in the room. So palliative, sometimes there's a lot of misunderstanding in the communities about what palliative care is. Many people understand it as end of life. So if the palliative chaplain's there, you are in big trouble. Mm-hmm. That's the primary, I would say, myth that I encounter in the work that I do every day.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. Like I said, when you see, like you experienced, somebody shows up with, a collar, and,
Yep.
yeah, who are you? What are you doing here? I thought you put that really well, that idea of, when you're the family member supporting the patient, or the patient yourself, yeah, you're keenly aware of who comes in and out of that room and what are they there for. And yeah.
And is this, are they can they be trusted, and are they safe?
Yeah. I mean, we talked about the unprecedented. Yeah. How has your role shifted over the last 15 months?
Yeah.
In the light of COVID? Yeah.
I think rather than shifted, I'm searching for the word that sort of what it has accelerated, picked up speed, become sort of increasingly intense, right? I'm doing the same work. I'm just doing it in a milieu in which everything is heightened.
Mm.
It's much better now, right? It's better in the hospital. It's better in the communities. It's better in the world. It's better in the hospital. But in March and April of 2020, fear was palpable, and I was afraid. Everyone was afraid because we didn't know what this was. Mm-hmm. We weren't sure how to protect ourselves. You have precautions, and they've always worked, but no one really knew what to expect from this disease, right? Mm-hmm. And so the first thing I had to do was deal with my own fear and apprehension, because I had nothing to offer to someone who was probably more afraid than I, right? Mm-hmm. So I would say I struggled with that for about a month, which was unusual at this point in my career. I don't encounter fear in quite the same way as I used to, right? I mean, mm-hmm. in my own life, but it was there, and so that had to be. I had to face that down and work through that very intentionally in order to continue to be effective as a chaplain.
Yeah, I think shift is probably the wrong word. More the idea of it was, hit by a tsunami, kind of. Yeah.
Well, it's like if it was smoldering, okay, if what the work was sort of historically, it's just smolders. People are smoldering. It was like somebody poured a tank of gas on it, and everything was
Lit.
Lit.
Mm-hmm.
But to speak more practically, what became immediately apparent was, first of all, overnight the hospital shut down. Right, nobody came in. Families. I work in this brilliant, incredible milieu that I just love the workplace that I'm in, the hospital that I'm in, and people are there. Families are there. There's community built in the ICUs. People are taking care of each other in the family. It was just alive. And overnight, all of that stopped. And people were no one was coming in to visit because it was just too problematic, right? No one, everyone needed to stop and assess and decide how to move forward. And it required, patients, families could not come in unless people were actively dying. Then, but that was the biggest, I think, the most daunting part of it. And the chaplain and the social workers, the nurses, everyone had to take on this additional role of providing, just compassion at the bedside, right? Because the families and people are isolated, they're lonely, they're scared. It was overwhelming.
Yeah, it made me think of just this eerie sort of ghost town kind of feeling. I know a lot of people were taking video or pictures during that time of like Times Square just at a dead stop with nobody out, and that I know for us in my practice, just all of a sudden having to deal with my own stuff at the same time as trying to help them. Exactly. And really struggling with coping skills and my own stress and overwhelm. So I can't imagine what it was like for you. And often people look to the medical community of like, what is this? What's going on? And when it's clear that we don't have a lot of answers, we don't know. People really that amps the fear and the anger and the everything to the nth degree.
Yes, it became, because I have a particular sort of way of understanding myself and my world. It became evident to me early on that, and I don't say this lightly, but COVID wasn't the problem. Fear was the problem. The disease, the bacteria, the virus, we would figure that out. But the fear that it engendered was what was just overwhelming and so intrusive. And I had to, I applied that to myself before I talked to anybody else. But I knew my fear was intruding on my capacity to care and to give care and to do the work that God had given me to do. And I hadn't been given that work to do on the best days, right? On the good days, on the non-COVID days. I had been asked to serve God's people and wherever and whenever. So that was something I had to deal with, and everyone did. So we muddled through and took care of each other, and the hospital did a fantastic job supporting the associates and staff and patients. And it's a year, 15 months later, and we're still here. Things are settling down a little bit. How are you?
Wait a minute.
Never mind.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Doing pretty well. I think as as the sun has come out more and daylight savings and we've gotten through winter,
Yeah.
you see that kind of return again to the outdoors and the vitamin D and fresh air. Our family kind of adopted this, like, there is no bad weather, just bad clothing kind of mindset. And we have two small children, so I was taking them to playgrounds or empty playgrounds or hikes and things like that to try to keep everybody active. And but yeah, it definitely seems like I guess a thawing out sort of concept. I had wanted to ask for you, there's that cliche, there are no atheists in war. Did you find that throughout this, or that it was like, very like either one way or the other, like kind of polarizing, or yeah?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I guess I would think about that a minute. I would say that illness. I don't think that it changed that dynamic. I don't think people were more. Oh, gosh, I'm not sure I'm telling you the truth. I have to think about that for a minute, John. The illness is illness in some ways. It was the COVID. It was the isolation. It was the profound isolation that made the illness so much worse, the experience so much worse. COVID presented, across a broad spectrum of symptoms. Some people were kind of just okay, but sick and needed to be isolated, right? Isolated whether they had symptoms or not. So the isolation was just an existential bomb. And so I think it wasn't so much a question of, am I going to die and do I need God, as where is everybody? Am I really alone? And making the case, I guess, in some ways, that God is with you did become a little more problematic, right? Because there was no one with you, except oftentimes the chaplain. We were having those conversations with people, and the isolation was crushing.
Yeah, it definitely made me think of Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, and we're very used to, for those that have experienced a loved one, getting ill, going into the hospital or going through hospice care. Yeah, you're used to, like, okay, there's visiting hours, there's a certain number of people that can visit, and then it just shut down to like zippy. For you, yeah, with being there, that was like, you're fully suited up in the room with them, or that was video conference, or yeah.
No, I did very little of the video conferencing. I saw patients as I had always seen. That was my practice, and as long as I was allowed to be in the room, and I was able to do that. And we had, thanks be to God, we had enough PPE to make that safe. But it did add an otherworldly, layer of plastic. I mean, literally.
Yeah, I mean, everything looked like the movie Outbreak, where you're just.
Yeah, it was something. But you kind of get used to that too, frankly. It didn't take long, but it was certainly, it presented, yet another layer of separation, right, between me and the person that I was there to serve. So we sort of had to work around all that. And the way I did that was to just acknowledge it right from the beginning. Look, I'm covered in plastic. It's hard to hear. Tell me if I need to shout. I'm happy to do that. It's not my style, but I can.
Mm-hmm.
But let's try to make the best of where we are and see what we can do together.
Yeah, I would think that would have to be difficult on your side, because I know on mine, just doing teletherapy,
Yeah,
invariably the technology would crap out when they're saying the most important thing, and you're like, I'm really
right.
sorry, but can you repeat that? And it's
Yeah,
just this awful, like, oh gosh.
yep,
Yeah.
yeah. I frankly preferred. I would rather be in the room with the PPE than outside the room on a video conference. That just
Mm-hmm.
to me personally was you know a better alternative.
Mm-hmm.
But other people use that. Other chaplains, other priests, nurses. I mean, use that very effectively.
Mm-hmm.
It was just finding where your comfort zone was.
Yeah, I was definitely thankful for the teletherapy. I still am.
Sure.
That necessity is the mother of invention, and just
Right.
like you said, we didn't have a lot of options, and like, okay, this is the new normal, so we have to get used to it and use what we've got.
Yep.
And I found for a lot of people, during that time, it was extremely useful. I think a lot of people now on the outpatient mental health side of things are, okay, some want to go back to in person, some don't, and it's kind of a mixture, but um
Right.
yeah, I mean, obviously you're already in a tight spot, and then in the last 15 months that spot got even tighter, and you're dealing with some pretty awful stuff, some pretty heightened emotions. Yeah, how do you help people navigate that? How long do you
Mm-hmm.
have? Yeah.
Um, well, I don't think that for me anyway, my sense was that um, they're still dealing with the same. They're still dealing with the same. It's fear of, uh, am I ever going to be the person I was? Fear that I will die, obviously. Um, and so, in some ways, fear doesn't really change that much. And so, dealing with that and helping people to address their fears. Because here, I'll tell you a little bit about my practice style. This has worked for me through COVID, and really, regardless of how the illness or the disease process. Right? People talk and they throw out. I think of it as threads. They throw out threads, sometimes dozens of threads of conversation. Right? Their minds are going everywhere. Their feelings are coming up, and they're throwing me all kinds of. And up to me to decide. I can't pick them all up, right? But I can decide. I can use my intuition and my experience to pick up the thread that has, in my sense, has the greatest likelihood of, when I follow it back, that it will go to the hurting place, to the place that's what I'm interested in. That's where I can serve. And um, and that didn't change in COVID. They were still throwing me. Um, they're still throwing me the same threads, and most often that thread is the fear. If I can follow the fear back, I will hear about what's most important to that person, and that's what I care about. What matters, and it's always attached. Those two things are interwoven. What matters most, and where they're greatest, and their greatest. And if I can spend some time with them in those places, listen attentively, something in there that that changes them and me, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting sort of mental picture of the threads and kind of looking for the, you know, somewhat of the linchpin one that okay, that's the one I need to take. Did you find during this that I mean, it's kind of hard to think of some of the positive in it, but did it simplify your role in a way? Because I could see prior to it where if you have a room full of people, you're dealing with multiple you know myths and beliefs and reactions to you and your role. Whereas with the COVID restrictions, it really simplified it down to just the patient. Did you find that or no?
Uh, well, most of my work, um, I do a lot of family meetings, of course, but most of my work, the bulk of my work, is one-on-one. I I time my visits. I attempt to see people, uh, partially, of course, because there's so much going on in the room anyway. I don't I don't want to add to what there's too much of already. So I really time my visits to when the person is alone. So that hasn't really, and they were alone a lot, right? I didn't have many other people to contend with, but no, I didn't really experience that. I am a one-on-one. That's where the bulk of my work is done, regardless of COVID.
Hmm. And how did you deal with, well, on the whole, how do you deal with the vicarious trauma, the compassion fatigue? I mean, we've heard a lot
Yeah,
about that over the, I
yeah.
would say probably the last 2 decades, more and more. Yeah. You're listening to OTC episode 68 with Linda Fisher, hospital chaplain with MedStar Hospital Center. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor.
Would you like to talk to a counselor but can't find the time? Would you rather talk to someone from the comfort of your own home? If so, Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. We now offer teletherapy to all clients who reside in the state of Pennsylvania. Using our secure portal, you can have a video session with your counselor using a laptop, desktop computer, or smartphone. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560 to see if teletherapy might be a good fit for you. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
How did you deal with, well, on the whole, how do you deal with the vicarious trauma, the compassion fatigue? I mean, we've heard a lot
Yeah,
about that over the, I
yeah,
would say probably the last 2 decades, more and more. Yeah.
yeah. Well, that's a very real thing. Um, it was real before COVID. It's been the one awareness that I had since I think about 2 years into my practice. But I'm going to quote Rachel Raymond, Dr. Raymond, who is she's an integrative physician, but she has written extensively around wellness, physician wellness. And she says, we burn out not because we don't care, we burn out because we don't grieve. Okay? And if you're going to do this kind of work and expect not to be touched by grief, it's tantamount to walking through water and not expecting to get wet. Okay? So grief, learning to grieve, learning how to grieve, how to tend to one's own suffering, because we all suffer. Some of us know it and some of us don't. But human beings suffer. And to be unaware of one's own suffering, in some ways, means to be unaware of the suffering of others. The more attuned we are to our own suffering, the more attuned and more present to the suffering of the others we can be. So for me, about 2 years, I was, before I came to the palliative work, I was still at MedStar Washington Hospital Center, but I was an outpatient oncology chaplain for 10 years. So I worked with people with cancer only for 10 years.
Mm.
About 2 years into my practice, I realized that the books that I kept with the people that I was praying for and the book that I kept of the dead, that everyone from the prayer book had moved over into the book of the dead.
Mm.
So people dying within 18 months or 2 years because they were so sick when they came. And I recognized that unless I was very intentional about grieving, I was probably not going to be able to do this work long term. And that was the one thing I wanted to do. I knew that I knew that I was being daily. I mean, to this day, I get up in the morning and I know for today, just for today, John, but I know for today that this is the work that God has given me to do. And I want to be able to do it. So I become early very intentional about praying, about crying, about processing, about having a spiritual director, a good therapist, and friends, and my garden, and my dog. And I do that work with great intention because I want to continue to work.
Hmm.
That makes sense?
Oh,
That's
yeah.
what I did it in COVID. It just took, I had to be, I had to be very on deck with myself around all that.
Well, and yeah, I think so often, especially in the medical profession, I always say, like, and I'm sure you've seen this, doctors and nurses are some of the worst patients. Like they, we, and I could see where during COVID that, I'll sleep when I'm dead kind of mentality of like, everybody needs me. It's all hands on deck right now. I don't have the luxury of caring for myself or coping skills. And to their detriment, I mean, you saw just, unfortunately, people in the medical profession ending their lives with guilt or survivor's guilt, and just crumbling under the weight of all of that stress and a lot of the burnout. Yeah, so I think
Can I
yeah, sure,
add?
sure.
I want to be, because this is something I've thought about a lot. I in no way was the experience that I've had in the last year can it touch the suffering that I saw from frontline providers, both at the hospital I worked in, but particularly at the outset when it just crushed people in New York. That was unspeakable. I don't know how anyone lived through that. So I have just tremendous admiration and respect and compassion for them, because it was like being run over by a train, right? I mean,
Every day.
every day. And so that was a tragedy that it was heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that I don't know that any self-care practice would have been equal to that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think at a lot of points, just holding on for dear life. Just
and doing, they're following the vocation that they, in some ways, I think the call that they have. I don't speak for them, but I haven't met many doctors who didn't wake up at one point in their lives and say, I want to heal people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a healer. That's what
and
man, oh man.
That brings up the, I'm assuming you've never seen it where you had to care for the patients and the coworkers as much as you did during this. Is that?
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
There's so much suffering. Everyone suffered, is suffering, but certainly then. And you could feel it on the units. It was in the air. It was palpable in a way. least I have not been through that before. Don't expect to do it again.
Yeah.
In my lifetime, anyway. God,
Yes.
but yeah, but it was. I have to say. I mean, I have to say honestly, I feel privileged to have been able to serve during this crisis. It was a privilege to serve, and I was grateful because in many hospitals, many chaplains, social workers were furloughed, right, and or worked from home. The team that I'm on, which is a large interdisciplinary team, none of us were furloughed. We were all considered integral to the day-to-day working of the hospital. So we were permitted to work, if you will, throughout that the worst of that crisis, which was a privilege.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, I was not aware of that. Yeah, just another facet I didn't think of. Going back to what you had said with Rachel Raymond, I thought that was so powerful. The importance of learning to grieve, and seeing you as somewhat of an expert on that, so to speak. Yeah, what would you want people to know about grief and how to do that? And,
Oh,
yeah.
John, don't get started on the grief thing. So, and thank you for asking, because it is probably one of the things that are closest to my heart. The lesson, if you will, that I learned from the death of my mother, the grief that I experienced in the death of my mother was overwhelming. I went over a cliff into a hole with all the resources that I had. I thought I will never come out of this dark tunnel. This will be where I will be for the rest of my life. And and learning to welcome that, to allow it, to embrace it, to participate in it. And in some ways, I think it was simply because I was so attached to my mother and I loved her so profoundly. I felt like grieving for her was the one thing that I could do, right? That she deserved that it was a tribute to her, and it was the price that I willingly paid for loving her so deep. And so I learned you don't die. The good news is, and the bad news, John, and this is probably something you understand very well. The good news is you don't die from grief. The bad news is you don't die from grief. And what you do with that matters. Grief will wait for you. It'll file its fingernails and stand at the door until something else happens, right? In my work with people who were trying to learn how to live and die with cancer, what would happen in my work with them directly was the trauma of the diagnosis would would open a door, and there would be a flood of grief about the diagnosis of cancer, your name and cancer in the same sense, right? But behind that door, now that the door was open, oh my gosh, look at everything, look at all these old losses, big and small, that had just been waiting for a chance to be honored and to be worked through and allowed to happen and to move on. And so that whole dynamic just became critically important to me. And I believe that my work as a chaplain is primarily grief work. That's what I do every day.
Mm-hmm.
I help people grieve.
Yeah, I just thought that was so beautifully put. I mean, you can hear your own personal experience, but your wisdom and experience in your work coming through. Just I always think of, and I forget who the quote is attributed to, but that myth that time doesn't heal all wounds; it sets up minefields. And we often think that, oh, it'll heal with time, and it doesn't. Like you said, it'll wait, it'll file its nails, it'll
hang out.
Yep.
And represent. And sometimes, no matter how well we do that work, it sometimes it just isn't finished, right? And
Yep.
it just comes. I have a metaphor that I think is beautiful. And it's of a river that the grief experience, the initial experience, throws us into the river with white water, right? And we are dragged with the white water for as long as we're dragged. At some point, we climb up, we straggle over to the edge, and we climb up out of that water, and we make our way back to something, right? The river is always there. It's just our relationship with the river that changes, right? The grief is there. Our relationship with it will change. And sometimes something will happen. I would push 2 years after my mother died, I'm pushing a grocery cart through the Safeway. And all of a sudden I had this, it was like a tsunami of sadness. And I thought, my mother. And so for that moment, I'd been picked up and thrown back in the river. I didn't stay there, but the grief never really goes away. It's just our relationship changes. And over time, that relationship, like any other relationship, will deepen or attenuate. I don't know. It's different for people, but it's important, incredibly important.
Yeah, possibly one of the most important things we can do.
Yes.
I liked what you had said about the tribute to your mother, but also it is directly tied to our ability to continue living.
Yeah.
It made me think of that old timey hymn that Wade in the Water.
Wade in the water.
Yeah, I will allow you to sing it. You don't want me to sing
No,
it. So.
But
yeah. And so often we try to pre-grieve. We try to get it out of the way when they're sick, or deal with it ahead of time so that it doesn't hit us later. And I think that's some of the processing and some of that acceptance, but at the same time you can't fully pre-grieve it. It's not like you make down payments on it.
Right. That's well said, John. You can try. The whole anticipatory grieving. I mean, that's a real process. That's an organic process, and that's real. But there is no way. I haven't found a way anyway, and I haven't talked to anyone who's found authentically with anyone who's found a way to protect themselves from the grief of particularly saying goodbye to people that we love. Nobody teaches us how to do that, right? Mm-hmm. We got to figure that one all by ourselves, and it hurts.
Are there resources you typically point people to? I know for myself, I often reference the children's book Tear Soup for kids, and then I rely pretty heavily on on death and dying and the 5 stages of grief kind of concepts. But yeah, are there ones that you typically point people to?
Well, I have to, in my work, I work with, I don't work independently. I work with social workers and who are brilliant. And, we will typically, in an interdisciplinary setting, when we have someone who has a profound grief experience, which are many, certainly in the ICUs that we work with, we sort of as a team or between the social workers and the chaplains decide whether this grief that we're seeing, is it complicated? Is it traumatic? Will they will they need additional resources when they leave in order to do the work of grieving? And I think there's a fair amount of literature, don't ask me for it because I can't remember, but that says that about 85% of people left on their own will move through the grief process well, and won't need additional resources. But then there's that 10 or 15% who have complicated. And we will then, if we've identified people like that, we will do bereavement follow-up. But I typically refer them to the Went Center here in Washington, the Went Center for Grief and Loss. And they are brilliant and probably completely overwhelmed by demand and need. So I hate to say it out loud, but they're a wonderful resource for people. And also hospice, who, you don't have to be a hospice patient in order to use their bereavement services. You can have access to them. I mean, there's a small payment, I think, that you have to make, but and certainly if you are a hospice patient, then we encourage people to take advantage of their bereavement services. But no, I don't have books. I don't really have books because I don't think, I don't know. I think you can read about grief, but grieving is what you have to do, right?
Yeah, definitely. And what goes into that sort of assessing for traumatic or complicated grief? What do you typically look for?
Oh gosh, well, I wish I had my wonderful social work. She's good at pulling this stuff up. It's typically, it's often women, married women of a certain age whose partners have died in an ICU after practice. I mean, that is a subset that we kind of are aware of. Anyone who has had a traumatic death in the ICU, people who have had brain death and organ donation, sudden traumatic death, we will pay close attention to those. Mm-hmm. And you get a sense from working with people, with families, sort of over time, whether or not this is going to be manageable. But there are indicators, and I just can't produce them because I don't keep them in my head.
Mm-hmm. Time's up.
Oh, that's I forget that people hear that.
Well, and I think it speaks also to, like you said, the amazing team that you have there. I mean, it sounds very much, like a team where you're, communicating with each other and, okay, I'm not needed in this situation, but you might, yep. And, kind of all sharing the load as much as you can.
And I probably should have hit that harder because we are heavily reliant on each other anyway, because we are in some ways a transdisciplinary team, but the team that there's multiple sub-teams, but we have doctors, nurse practitioners, social workers, chaplains, and pharmacists. So it is as as interprofessional as it can be. Mm-hmm. And that having each other there for each other during COVID was a huge part of how we sort of weathered that as both individually and as a team. So I am grateful, profoundly grateful for my colleagues, for their support and the ways we sort of shouldered through that together.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess to end on, I would ask, what's one or two things maybe that we haven't already covered, if you could speak to everybody about, palliative chaplaincy or grief, what's something you would want them to know?
Well, I'm gonna say this because it is the one thing I want everybody to know, and that is that none of us know well enough, is that we are loved. We are profoundly and deeply loved, both by, I think, our people in whatever way they do that, and then by whatever whatever one's understanding is of whatever is larger than we are by any name, the divine mercy, divine kindness, that love fuels this universe, whether it looks like it or not. That's the one thing I would like to say. But that the other, and I noticed, it's kind of like the doorknob thing when the doorknob issue when in therapy, you kind of come to the most important part of the work sort of at the end. But grief, don't be afraid of grieving. It's not a failure. It is not a lack of faith. It is not a lack of internal fortitude. It is not a lack of anything. It is a human experience. It is built into our DNA. It's intended for us to grieve. It's the cost of loving. And to not grieve would be to not love. And that doesn't seem like sustainable, right? Living without love would just be, you might as well be dead. The kind of death.
Yeah. No, I thought that was very well said. I've heard, I think it's Jonathan Decker has a YouTube channel for cinema therapy, and he talks about pain as the cost of loving. And,
yes.
Yeah, very similar to what you said. Yeah.
Yes. Add to that the cure for the pain is in the pain. Cure for the pain is in the pain.
Mm-hmm.
So
I often say that the answer is in the process.
Yes.
And I think you had said with your experience with your mother that, going into that off the cliff and into that pit with all of the resources and allowing that to kind of swallow you was the way through. Yeah.
Yes. And to transform that experience. Because when I look back now, if I may just look back to that, it was a rebirth. It was a death and it was a rebirth. Mm-hmm. And two things had to happen together. They could never have been independent. Mm-hmm. I could never be where I am today. I couldn't be talking today had she not died, and had I not in some way died with her and been rebirthed through that experience. So I'm eternally grateful to you for the opportunity to talk about this, John, because I don't get to do it very often.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I just the amazing work that you do, obviously, sadly, so needed over the last 15 years and beyond, but I can't thank you enough, for your experience and being called to that, that idea of the firefighters being called to go towards the fire as opposed to away from it. And obviously so needed. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your compassion, your kindness, and your thoughtful questions. It's been a real pleasure to spend this time with you. And I'd
love to stay in touch with you and possibly have you back on. But thank you for sharing, and I hope our listeners really get something out of it. I'm sure that they will. There you have it, OTC listeners. Episode 68 is done. Thanks, as always, for stopping by and taking a listen. And thank you to Skylar Cunningham for connecting me with Linda. And a huge, huge thank you to Linda Fisher for being willing to share of her time, especially during this crazy chapter in our world. If you want to learn more about Linda Fisher and the work that she does as hospital chaplain, or more about the MedStar Washington Hospital Center, you can go to medstarwashington.org. That's medstarwashington.org. All right. Next episode is OTC episode 69, where I'm having Joe Sanok back on the show, twice in one season even, to talk about his upcoming book, Thursday is the New Friday, which drops October 5th, so you can go ahead now and pre-order your copy, but check out the interview next episode. Take care.